So I'm here to talk about top harassment issues for employees. And I've been giving variations of this talk for years and years and years. And I used to do the sort of standard, the definition of harassment is type talk, and I was boring myself to death. And more importantly, it wasn't all that effective. I would see people nodding out. If you need to take a nap, then it's okay. I will consider it as a sign that you trust me, that you fall asleep in front of me. So that's okay too. But I hope to liven this up a little bit with actual real-life examples, because I have been collecting them from our members, also just sort of around the state and around the country. And so I'm going to be doing a little bit of gossiping, which hopefully you'll find to be of some interest. So have we been seeing harassment issues in the news at all lately? Only like every day, right? And I've been gathering headlines and slapping them on this PowerPoint slide, but I had to stop because the slide actually was starting to bulge out like that. And so I really had to stop that. But you can kind of read some of these and see that some of them are actual Colorado examples, and many of them involve governments of various kinds, local governments, state government, et cetera. But let's start by going quickly over Gunnison's policies, because I think that's important. And you do have a good state-of-the-art policy when it comes to identifying harassment issues and then providing a conduit for surfacing up complaints or concerns that you may have around it. So we start with sort of the statement that we do not permit discrimination based upon any of the protected classes here in the city of Gunnison. So that's kind of the basic underlying premise of harassment laws. And then we go on to define what unlawful harassment is. Basically, harassment needs to touch upon one or more of those protected categories, right? So whether it be age or ethnicity or gender or disability or any of those other protected classes, harassment does need to touch upon one of them. And then it can take various forms, right? It can be person-to-person conduct, or it can be the circulation of emails or photographs, or physical conduct, right? Physical or verbal conduct that is of a harassing nature. Sexual harassment has sort of a special dimension, and so that's why it is commonplace for policies, including Gunnison's, to talk about some of the differences between sexual harassment and other types of protected category harassment. So if you look at sort of the rest of the protected categories and where harassment surfaces, those are all going to be hostile work environment situations, right? Where the joking or the physical conduct or whatever it is of such a severe and pervasive nature that it kind of begins to alter in a terrible way the conditions of employment, and then you need to step forward and say something so that something can be done about it. So that concept of hostile work environment applies to all types of harassment. Where there's a special dimension, it has to do with sexual harassment, where there are two types of harassment. Obviously, hostile work environment can happen with sexual harassment, right? But the special dimension that applies only to sexual harassment has to do with what is called quid pro quo harassment. And sort of the prototypical example of this actually happened in municipal government, and it went something like this. Anybody here from Parks and Rec? I'll probably pick on every department before the hour is through, but this example happened in Parks and Rec. It happened in the lifeguard group, and the head lifeguard said to one of the lifeguards he supervised, "Date me, or you'll be cleaning toilets for the next year." Can you see the quid pro quo there, right? Either you will submit to my demands that you date me, or your job is going to be really miserable, right? So that was quid pro quo. And you can see how that only operates in the sexual harassment arena. It doesn't translate over to other types of harassment. And then there is a complaint procedure. And the complaint procedure is really important for a couple of reasons. Number one, we want to hear about your concerns in this regard in the workplace. And so we want to make sure that you have a comfortable and effective means to surface over any concerns you may have in this regard, and a process for following up, to look into and to administer appropriate consequences. That's important, right? Because that's the way we deal with these kinds of issues. The other reason why this is in place, frankly, is for liability reasons. An employer that has an effective process for surfacing up complaints and dealing with them when warranted is going to have protections from liability. But obviously, from our standpoint on a day-to-day basis, this is a process that's in place so that any issues you may have can be dealt with appropriately. So please never feel like you're boxed in and can't surface forward a concern that you may have. One of the ways in which harassment policies typically differ from other types of policies is that there's not a strict chain of command process, right? Because if there were a strict chain of command process whereby, we were to say to you, if you have a complaint about harassment issues, you need to talk to your direct supervisor. Well, what if it was the direct supervisor who was the problem, right? Then you would be boxed in. And so your policy, as is appropriate, does provide multiple avenues for bringing forward issues that you may have. The other important protection that this policy has is anti-retaliation. I think one of the reasons why many of us do hesitate to come forward is, well, if I come forward with an issue, my life in this city is going to be miserable from here on forward, right? And so this policy says we will protect you from retaliation. So should you ever be in a position where you bring a complaint or a concern, right, through these channels, and then thereafter you feel as though, well, now my life is miserable because I'm being retaliated against, well, that's a second policy violation that will be followed up on and dealt with appropriately. So I do want to make sure that there is that assurance in the city's policies. The other thing that I want to quickly touch upon is your anti-violence policy. You may think, well, violence, harassment, they don't really seem to be related much, but your anti-violence policy not only deals with things like physical abuse and threats, but it also deals with things like intimidating behaviors. And so you can see where bullying behavior could conceivably come within the parameters of your anti-violence policy. And the reason why I bring up bullying is that sometimes bullying behaviors have an element of harassment, right? And I'll give you an example or two as we go along. And so the two topics, I think, are somewhat interrelated. So the issues that I want to talk about, number 5 is that harassment claims are alive and well. Everybody agree with me on that? They're alive and well in municipal government and pretty much every other workplace around the country these days. And so I've got some actual examples of things that happened, either among SURSA members that I worked with or that I read about around the state. And so here's a little bit of gossip around them. I hope we can learn some lessons around them too. So the first example, real life example, is what I call TWD, or texting while drunk. And here's the way I picture the scenario happening, although I don't know if this is really what happened, but I picture a supervisor. It was a Friday night. He was relaxing in his hot tub, with a glass of champagne and his smartphone, and he was like, well, I'm just going to text one of the people that reports to me. And that texting became very inappropriate. And so the employee who was having to deal with these texts eventually gathered up a list of inappropriate behaviors and then brought them forward, and somebody lost their career as a result. It was kind of a sad situation all the way around, but I think that the employee was absolutely justified in saying, these are becoming real problems for me and something needs to be done. Compliments. Do we compliment each other in the workplace? We do, right? Nice outfit, like your new haircut. Can you conceive of a scenario where a compliment kind of starts to become inappropriate? I've seen a few of those in the workplace. And again, you know, when you add those to a laundry list of other inappropriate behaviors, they can become enough to take somebody's career down. This happened in a city where I was a city attorney some years ago. And again, it was a whole bunch of behaviors. It was not just this one behavior. But essentially, this happened with an HR assistant in the HR department. Kind of ironic, I guess. But the HR assistant, on her last day of employment, came forward to the city manager and said, hey, I need to tell you about a whole bunch of really awful things that have been happening to me during the 3 years that I've been here, and that is why I'm leaving, and I think that you should know about it today, right? And we were like, today? Why didn't you let us know about this like a couple of years ago? And she pointed to the harassment policy, which her HR director had written, and it said, all harassment complaints must come to me, the HR director. And so she was like, I was boxed in, right? The person I wanted to complain about is the person I had to complain to. And so I really didn't feel like I had any options open to me. But one of the things in her laundry list was overly personal compliments. So it wasn't just new outfit, I like it, or something like that, right? It was, when I see you in that red dress of yours, right, looking her up and down, I know that, you know, I'm going to be dreaming about you tonight. Creepy, right? Beyond creepy, right? Add that to a list of 10 other creepy behaviors, and yeah, it's more than enough, I think, to take somebody's career down. Love letters. Do we write each other emails in the workplace? Sometimes we do. I hope that none of them are love letters, because if they are, it's like, well, thanks for the evidence, right, of inappropriate things. You've made our job easy for us. But this happened in a couple of contexts that I can share with you. One involved an employee who was able to look across the hall at another employee and eventually developed a crush or fascination with the employee. And so a love letter was written by email. And the love letter was kind of like this. When I gaze into the deep blue pool of your beautiful blue eyes, I could drown. Creepy? Yeah, add that to, right, 7 or 8 other things that were going on, and it took a career down. This happened to be somebody that I had worked with, liked, respected, and I felt like it was a tragedy all the way around. I felt that it was the correct result, but tragic nonetheless. Another love letter I remember, I read it myself, it was handwritten, by somebody highly placed in public works. Anybody here from public works? Okay. So this love letter was like, I myself am a member of Mensa, the high IQ club, right? It's like, really? This is not really, you know, and as a member of Mensa, I must say that every time I have a conversation with you, I am completely enthralled by your mind, right? this love letter was written to a police officer. And so among other things, I was like, if you're going to do this, do you really want to do this with somebody who carries 30 pounds of weaponry around their belt? Because they know how to take care of themselves, right? And so this person did eventually say, I'm really so beyond creeped out that I need to complain. And they complained to the manager. The manager looked into it, and the manager said to the public works person, I know you're planning a retirement this year. Let's move up the date of your retirement. And so that's kind of what happened. And so you can see some of these are sort of common, right? Sharing a dream that you had. Yep, that happened, right? It was a salacious dream. And so if you have a salacious dream, I would recommend that you not share it with others in the workplace. Stalking. This was a really weird one. This was a brand new supervisor, field supervisor, who didn't really have the tools in place to sort of develop a good sense of teamwork with the people that they supervise. And so they kind of devised their own approach to maybe improving teamwork. And it kind of went like this. Well, you know, the people I supervise don't really seem to be wanting me around much, so I'm just going to follow them around. Maybe at lunchtime when they're getting their sandwich, I'm going to stand in line behind them, and then they're going to look around and they're going to be like, ah, you again, right? Or I see that the people that I supervise now are not inviting me to beers after work, so I'm just going to invite myself. I'm going to stand at the table like this until they turn around, and then they're going to be like, ah, you again, right? So this happened a number of times. And one of the people being supervised actually came forward with a complaint, which was, I think my new supervisor is being a creeper. And I was like, creeper? Is that what a creeper is? Yeah, that's what a creeper is, right? I think I'm being stalked, was, you know, the response of one of the employees who kept seeing this supervisor in the field. And so an investigation was done, and it was determined that indeed there was no intent to stalk, right? It really was a case of a new supervisor who didn't have other more effective tools to try to build solid working relationships with people. So once that was discovered, you know, the right tools were given, and I think things moved on in a better direction. Emails. Do you guys email each other? Yeah, it happens. I'll give you an example from my workplace where email got somebody in really deep trouble. Do you guys have the global address book where if you hit the word all, right, everybody's address comes up? Well, in my workplace, somebody wanted to send a dirty picture to his friend Al, okay? Extra L in the email address, and it went to everybody in the organization, okay? So can you imagine that some heavy-duty corrective action was taken at that point, right? You know, a warning, and if it happens again, the consequences will be really, really severe. Did it happen again? It did. I am suspecting now that the person maybe needed glasses, because that's certainly an issue with me and my ability to see what I'm typing. But this time it didn't just go to everybody in the organization. It went out to all of our members, all 250 of them. So possibly one of you would have gotten it too. At that point, did somebody lose their job? Yeah, somebody had to lose their job. It was so tragic for me because the person was well-liked, doing an otherwise good job, you know, maybe some typos, but otherwise doing a good job. And I remember meeting the person and the person's spouse at the office over the weekend because I didn't want to make the person have to, you know, cart out their box of office tchotchkes, you know, during the week with everybody watching. And they were so sad and so gracious, and it was really just a sad, tragic thing that it had to happen that way. Jokes. Now, I hear sometimes there is joking in this workplace. Am I right? Never, okay. Now, jokes are good, right? Jokes are fine. Jokes are a way that you can, bond with each other and have a little fun. And fun in the workplace is a good thing, right? It's a good thing. But is it possible for jokes to go too far? It is, right? You might actually initiate the first joke about whatever it is, right? Maybe you're blonde, and so you initiate the first blonde joke, right? And it's cute, and it's strictly G-rated, right? But then pretty soon, those jokes start escalating, and they pass the R-rated, right? And they become sort of hurtful. At that point, does the person who initiated that first blonde joke have the right to say, hey, I know I made the first one, and maybe I brought this into, right, my workplace, but now that it's up to here, I have a problem with it. Is it legit for a person to be in that position? I say absolutely, and this has happened a couple of times among CIRSA members where somebody made the first joke, and it might have touched upon some protected class, right? But when it escalated, they were like, this is no longer funny, and I need it to stop. And I think it is a legitimate position to be in. So that can happen. Comments or behaviors that are memorably offensive. Have you ever watched a coworker or maybe a supervisor say or do something where you're like, I can never unremember this. I will remember this forever. There is not enough mind bleach in the world for me ever to erase this, right? Sometimes people do that, and it is not forgotten. And they are putting themselves at risk that this memorably offensive behavior or comment will come out, right, and wreck a career. This has happened a number of times around the country. This happened to a police chief some years ago, where a couple of his sergeants took note of the fact that he had said some memorably offensive things about one of his frequent flyer citizens, right, who was of a particular ethnicity, and it was truly memorably offensive, right? And so at some point, those sergeants went public with it, and a career went down the tubes. Now, you might wonder, why did these two, right, choose to surface this behavior? But I say the why doesn't really matter, right? Because if it happened, right, and it was offensive and memorably offensive, and there should have been consequences, then the fact that it went public and the whys and the timing really don't matter, right? Because it happened the way that they're saying it happened. So I think it was an appropriate consequence. Open mic night, Engine 11. This actually happened in a municipal government in Colorado. I'm going to call them out, Aurora, because they're not CIRSA members. And also, this actually did play out in the papers. It was all over. In fact, I think I listened to the actual dispatch tape. Kind of shocking. So a lieutenant is riding with one of the EMTs that he supervises in a fire truck, and he gets on dispatch and does his, communications with dispatch, and then he flips the microphone off, he thinks, and then he proceeds to talk about another employee that he supervises in some pretty starkly awful terms, right? Talking about her personal life in kind of an embarrassing way. Meanwhile, dispatch is like, Engine 11, your microphone is still on. Engine 11, your microphone is still on. He's virtually shouting because they're oblivious to the fact that this, stuff is coming out on the airwaves. But eventually the lieutenant is like, oh, oops, and flips the microphone off. But it's too late, right? Everybody has heard it. A record has been preserved. The employee, right, who was talked about has heard it, and she complains that was terrible, should not have happened, right? Did she have a legit complaint? Most certainly. You know, when I did this talk in another community, I got a little bit of pushback from somebody who said, that was one human mistake, right? Does that mean that was sexual harassment? But I guess my response back is this. Should a supervisor be talking about somebody that he supervises in such a starkly negative fashion, right? About her personal life? I don't think it was okay, and maybe it was one human mistake, but I think it was a human mistake that did warrant some consequences, you know, which there most certainly were. This one is more about public embarrassment. I'm not sure, you know, what it means in the context of sort of the larger issues of harassment law, other than this. For those of us who have been in the workplace for a long time, I am thanking, right, with everything I have, the fact that there was not an internet when I was coming up in the workplace and doing some things and saying some things I shouldn't have said or done, right? Because there was a time when bad behavior kind of stayed local, right? Now bad behavior goes viral and it goes around the world like that. And this was an instance of that. It's kind of humorous unless you were one of the people involved. So this was a sheriff's deputy. I can talk about them because they're counties. But the sheriff's deputy was in the office. He had to make a call to a local reporter, okay? And so he leaves her a voicemail. He hangs up the phone, he thinks, and then he and another deputy proceed to talk about the reporter and some of her, I don't know, I'm guessing some of her physical attributes. Somebody said maybe they were talking about grades. I don't know, but, right? And so this all got captured on a voicemail, and she heard the whole thing. Now, if you're gonna do that, may I suggest that you not do that with a member of the local media? Because you know what happened next, right? It went viral, and a couple of deputies were hanging their heads as the sheriff told them never to do that again. So, untouchables. Do we sometimes deal with people that could be considered untouchables? By untouchables, I mean people who may be sort of beyond the normal reach of our personnel policies, right? Who is within the reach of our personnel policies? Employees, right? And so I'm talking about folks who are not necessarily employees, potentially elected officials, potentially vendors, potentially customers, other people that we come in contact with, law enforcement, code enforcement. Do you come in contact with citizens, right? And so all of these people I consider untouchables in the sense that they're not directly covered by our personnel policies. And even if they are, you know, consequences are kind of difficult when it comes to non-employees because it's not like we can say, we're going to take corrective or disciplinary action against you, Mr. Vendor, right? It's kind of an awkward situation. But, you know, all of these untouchables are potentially people who can engage in unwanted, inappropriate behavior about which you have every right to say, I don't like it, it needs to stop, I'm bringing this forward. And so I want to make sure that you're well aware that they may seem like they're untouchables, but they're really not. Because if you surface forward an issue about one of them, then really your supervisor, your department head, the manager does have an obligation to look into it and to do something about it, right? So if it's a vendor, right, who is engaging in inappropriate, unwanted behavior, say something about it, right? Because there is something that can and should be done about it. I remember an instance where, you know, I used to be in private practice doing municipal government work, and so one of my mayors would come and visit my office every once in a while, and we would go out to lunch and talk about, you know, upcoming issues and stuff. Unbeknownst to me, He was saying some shocking things to the people in the reception area of my office. He was like, "Hello, Lynn. Those are some nice legs you got there." And doing that kind of thing. I did not know about this until he was no longer mayor. And then at that point, the receptionist came to me and she was like, "Ha ha ha, remember that mayor? Do you know what he used to say to me?" And I was like, right? Because it would have put me certainly in an awkward position, but I would have had an obligation to say something, to do something, if I had known about that conduct while it was happening, right? I had that responsibility. In Denver, I don't know if you read the Denver area papers or look at the Denver area news, but we've got an instance of an untouchable, right? Because not only is he an elected official, but the way Denver is set up, it's not like he is a part of the council. And so the council is not really even in a position to do anything about it. And so it's awkward, but doing nothing is not an option even there. So please make sure that you surface forward any issues that you have any time, whether the concerns arise from somebody who I've characterized as an untouchable or not, because bring it forward, we'll look into it, and if there is an issue, then we do have an obligation to do something about it. Consequences of harassment. Some of these are obvious, right? It can be grounds for disciplinary action up to and including termination. There can be a personal liability issue there, because somebody who engages in harassment, right, always has a potential personal liability. The city also has a liability issue if it didn't have in place an effective mechanism to deal with that kind of behavior. And so personal liability, city liability. Damaged goods. Does that kind of resonate? Some of these folks who were accused of inappropriate behaviors where investigation revealed that those accusations were in fact well-founded, right? Not only did they potentially lose their positions, but going forward, they were really damaged goods, right? Because this allegation is the kind of allegation that can follow you around. I have an instance at Sursa where we actually interviewed somebody for a position, and on paper, right, really impressive credentials. So I'm part of the interview committee. He sits down in front of us. First words out of his mouth, "I suppose you've heard about the harassment allegations that were leveled against me at my last workplace." We were like, "No, do tell," right? And we were very puzzled as to why somebody would be like bringing this stuff out affirmatively. And then we sort of asked around, and sure enough, it had made all the papers and everybody was gossiping about it. And so he felt compelled to bring it up first in an effort to do a little damage control. So clearly damaged goods, right? Loss of credibility, right, for the organization, loss of morale potentially. Explaining to the family why you lost your job, right? I think of a couple of these people that I have worked with and them having to go home on a Wednesday at 3 p.m., not having a job anymore, coming home, right, carrying their little box of office tchotchkes. Their spouse opens the door and they're like, "Hi, honey, you're home early," right? Having to explain what happened. That's kind of painful for me to think about that. I sure don't want anybody to have to go through that. And then let's talk about liability and coverage, because at Sursa we pride ourselves on having really good coverage for officials and employees who get sued in matters pertaining to their work. But I am here to tell you that there's not a whole lot of coverage for harassment type allegations. Here's how it plays out. Let's say there's a harassment allegation. You are accused, hypothetically, of having engaged in harassing behavior, okay? And then the city is also alleged to have had an ineffective mechanism for dealing with that behavior. So we would look first to Russ and say, Russ, I see that the city has been sued, and so Russ, I will assure you that we will defend the city, and if you lose that lawsuit, we'll pony up the check, right? And then we would turn to you and say, all right, ma'am, Russ, do you want us to defend her or not, right? City makes the call. Do we defend you or not? And why do we do that? Because it's possible that the city has already investigated the matter, and they're like, yeah, we investigated, and those complaints, every one of them, well-founded, right? So cut her loose. And then we'd be like, good luck in your lawsuit, okay? Or let's say that the lawsuit is the first time that we have ever heard of such allegations against you. They've never been investigated because they never were surfaced before. And Russ would say, no, go ahead and defend her, right? We don't know anything about these allegations. Then we'd be like, okay, here's your defense attorney. Good luck in the lawsuit. And then, oops, you lost. A jury says that you did all of these things. Okay, well, we'll pony up the check against the city, but I hope you have got, plenty of money in your checking account because we are not paying the damages on your behalf. So that's how the coverage works. At best, you get a defense, right, if the city says yes, but we never pay the damages if damages are awarded against you. So it's kind of a, limited coverage, but that's kind of the way the market works when it comes to harassment allegations. Dating in the workplace, does that happen? It happens. You don't have to fess up to me, but I'll fess up to you. This was in my very first job in college. I've been a longtime municipal geek, and so I started at the city of Boulder when I was 18 years old, working in the HR department. But I was a low-level, part-time student. But I was 18, and so I wasn't smart enough to think about, well, what would be the consequences if I dated a coworker, right? Another 18-year-old, part-time student. And so we dated, and then we didn't date, but we both kept working there. And was it awkward at best, like every day thereafter? It was awkward at best every day thereafter. I'd be like, good morning, right? Try not to see that person, right? But at least we were not in a situation of unequal power in the organization where it could have been much worse than awkward, right? And so I'm really glad that I learned that lesson early, but we don't all learn that lesson, and we don't all learn it early. This is an example of somebody whose extremely promising career as a leader, right, has been interrupted at a minimum because the allegations came out that he had been dating not one, not two, but 3 people in his own department, right? And how did those allegations eventually come out? It wasn't through any of the people he had been dating. It was command staff who was like, we are seeing some serious morale issues around here as a result of this situation, and therefore we are compelled to bring it out to the public, right? And that's what happened. This one hit close to home for me because my first job as a lawyer was a lobbyist in the Colorado State Legislature working for the Colorado Municipal League. And so when I read about this, it was an Iowa leader and a lobbyist working for the Iowa Municipal League. And they were caught kissing in a public place. And there was video, and it went viral all over the place. And I was like, wow, right? I wasn't so much thinking of him, right? I was kind of thinking of her, right? And her future, and how possibly it had been tarnished by this. And this hit home for me for another reason, because when I was lobbying, we had our equivalent of that in the leadership of one of the houses of the legislature. We had a leader there who had a habit, this is well known, of insisting that the female lobbyists give him a smackaroo on the lips and a big hug every morning as a greeting. It's like before you could talk to this person about legislation, right, the entry fee was a smack on the lips and a hug. And it was awkward. All of the women knew about it. Did any of us complain? I don't think we did. You know, it was during a time when there weren't effective policies in place, and so we were kind of at a loss as to what to do other than to warn one another, which we did, right? And one of the warnings told to me was, Tammy, this is going to happen, but as soon as you kill one of his bills, he will suddenly become very formal and correct with you, right? So I had to just wait until the time that I killed one of his bills, and then things did change for the better. I actually fessed this up 30 years later, right, to the people at the place where I was working, and they were like, oh yeah, well, we knew about it. And in fact, we talked to him about it, and we said it had to stop. Did it stop? I don't know. You know, I worry now that the fact that I didn't come forward in a timely fashion back then may have contributed, right, to the culture that they're dealing with in the Colorado State Legislature now. Have you been reading about these harassment allegations and the hearings and the expulsion and, you know, spending six figures on investigations and all this stuff happening? And I wonder, right, did I maybe play a very small part in allowing that culture to grow and fester? So, you know, we have that responsibility, I think, to make sure that our culture is the way that we say it is. Quid pro quo, dating, right, kind of go hand in hand. And so that's another reason why dating in the workplace is such a risky thing, especially among people who are not equals in the organization. Any of the law enforcement folks ever hear Gordon Graham, noted speaker on ethical issues? Love that guy. You know, he is just so like in your face about things that he considers stupid, and among the things that he considers stupid, dating in the workplace. In fact, he says it's extremely stupid, and I can't really disagree. Using or tolerating a bullying style. I'm not asking for a show of hands here, but I can pretty much guess that many of us have been subjected at one time or another to a bullying style of supervision, right? It happens. People who are ineffective supervisors may turn to bullying and intimidation, yelling, cussing, threats as sort of their substitute for more effective forms of supervision. But is it okay? I don't think it's okay. Now, one of your values is that we will respect, right, our different styles and approaches in the workplace, but I do not feel that being intimidated or yelled at or cussed at or somebody using their sort of physicality to try to threaten or intimidate you, those I cannot, you know, chalk up to different styles in the workplace. To me, those are unacceptable approaches. Why am I talking about this in the context of harassment? Well, it's because sometimes bullying contains elements that start to look like harassment, right? I remember one supervisor who got in a whole bunch of trouble over this would yell, right? He would cuss, he would use his physicality, and he would say things that were really out of line. And some of the things he would say would be along the lines of, "You're just a bunch of girls," right, to a bunch of guys. And so you can see how, yeah, that's bullying, but it starts to look like harassment on the basis of gender type issues too. And so you can see that there is a connection there. Not speaking out in a timely fashion. That to me is number one. You know, by my own example, I think I've illustrated for you, right, some of the lingering thoughts that I have about not having spoken up. Harassment is still a major problem in many, many workplaces. And so We all have responsibilities in that regard. We have a responsibility not to engage in inappropriate conduct ourselves, and we have a responsibility to speak out when it happens. And supervisors, directors, and managers have a responsibility to follow up and do the right thing around it. So, you know, if you don't speak out, things are never going to get better, right? Or if you decide, well, I'm just going to save up all of these issues until I have, 30 of them, right? Some of them are going to get stale, right? It's like that happened way a long time ago. What do you expect that we can do about it now, right? Or how are we going to be able to look into this and follow up when it happened so long ago? And so I feel like we have a responsibility to speak up promptly and not save up a whole bunch of issues until you feel like, well, now, right, now is the time. Speak up in a timely fashion. Also, I have had some employees who will say to themselves, well, I am going to speak out, but I'm going to tell my supervisor that I want them to keep this a secret, and I don't want them to do anything about it. Is that a tenable position to be in, for you to say, I'm going to speak out, but I don't want anything done about it, right? That is a beyond awkward place in which to put your supervisor, right? Because your supervisor has responsibilities to look into and follow up. And so if you condition coming forward on don't say anything, keep this a secret, and don't do anything, then that really is untenable. In response, I have to say two things. Number one, right, if you tie my hands as your supervisor, things are never going to get better, right? And secondly, to the extent that you don't want anything done because you're worried about the consequences in terms of retaliation, please be assured you have protection from retaliation, right? And the consequences for retaliation are just as severe, if not more severe, than the consequences for the underlying behavior that you're concerned about. Bystanders, have you ever observed an interaction that concerns you even though you were not part of it yourself? I've seen this happen, right? I'll be walking by, minding my own business, but I will overhear, right, somebody saying something to somebody else where I'm like, dang, that crossed the line, right? Or, dang, that joke really went beyond the pale, right? Do we as bystanders have any power to influence those situations? I think we absolutely do. Now, we don't have to be like the, police, right? The workplace police and say, this must stop immediately, right? Or I shall have to report you, right? We don't have to do that, but as bystanders, we can do things. One of the things we can do is, maybe discreetly go to the person who was on the receiving end of that inappropriate behavior, and you can support that person, right? You can say, I heard this happen, right? I was there. Are you okay with it? Because if you're not okay with it, then I'm here for you, right? That kind of support is huge, because oftentimes people who are on the receiving end of this kind of behavior feel very isolated, right? They feel unsupported. And so the fact that there's a coworker saying, I saw it, right? And if you want to do something about it, right, I'm with you, right? That's huge. Or another thing you can do is to go to the person who was doing that inappropriate thing, and you can say, hey man, I heard that joke, and that's really, that crosses a line. That really interferes with our value system, right? It was disrespectful. Hearing that from a coworker is huge, right? Or another example I heard earlier, right? I heard that, and that was hurtful, right? You don't have to call people out for being politically incorrect, but you can call somebody out, right, for being hurtful. And that's huge, isn't it? Because none of us wants to intentionally hurt another, right? Or at least most of us don't. And so if you speak in terms of hurtful, right, that is, I think, a good way to broach that topic. So in conclusion, you know, we can characterize harassment issues in different ways, right? And one of the ways in which I've heard them characterized is, oh, this is just more political correctness in the workplace, right? I'm not going to argue with that, right, characterization, but I feel like harassment issues are really about power in the workplace. In the first instance, right, the power is exercised by the person who engages in that inappropriate behavior, right, because she can, right? So she's got the power in the first instance to say or do that inappropriate thing. But as soon as that floats over to the person who has to receive that behavior, then the power transfers over too, right? Because now the power is in the hands of the person who is able to complain about it, right? And that person is like, hey, thanks for that hand grenade, right? Should I lob it back now? Or should I wait till I have a few more hand grenades and then I will really wreck a career, right? So even if we can't respect harassment issues, you know, around this issue of political correctness, I think we have to respect them in terms of the power that these issues have to wreck our careers, right, or wreck somebody else's career. And so, you know, think of it that way, and hopefully we'll never have to come to the point where, you know, you're having to receive or lob back hand grenades, because I think Gunnison is really a very forward-thinking city in terms of, you know, creating values, buying into values, and then making sure those values are carried out. Respect in the workplace, the EEOC has recognized that that's at the root, right? That is at the root. If there's a lack of respect in the workplace, then all of these problems will follow. But if there is respect in the workplace, then I believe that you will never have to worry about whether these kinds of issues will ever surface and whether they will rise to the level of a harassment issue.
Great. Well, Tammy, thank you very much
Thank
for joining
you.
us today.
Thank you.